Hi, everybody. It's Joe Cioffi here. It is Sunday night on this Labor Day weekend. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. Those of you who caught the live stream this morning with regards to everything that's going on in the tropics, getting very busy. So here's how we're going to do. First off, I think I resolved this technical issue, or at least I hope so, with regards to the signal going in and out. So hopefully I won't have that problem. Maybe I spoke too soon, but hopefully I will not have that problem. The We're going to talk about first things first. We're going to talk about the system that is now in the Bahamas, moving through the western Bahamas and going to be crossing South Florida and then heading into the Gulf of Mexico, since that is going to have impact in the next several days. And the National Hurricane Center has already put out one of their potential tropical cyclone state advisories, indicating that there's a high likelihood that this is going to become a tropical storm, either Monday or perhaps Monday night into Tuesday. Then we're going to talk about Tropical Storm Florence, because that is a long way off, and all the complications and the models, the weather models, and how they're handling this. And we're going to focus in on what the keys to all of this are in both instances. Um, First off, with regards to the system that's going into the Gulf of Mexico, right now it would be my opinion that the system is going to probably become a tropical storm, and it might strengthen a bit. I don't think it's going to have a whole lot of time between Monday and by the time it makes landfall, which might be somewhere along the central Gulf Coast Tuesday night or on Wednesday. So I'm not sure that it really has enough time to get really revved up, but it still could be a system that will produce heavy rains, gusty winds, and that is going to need to be dealt with. Obviously, the system also it's going to be looks like it's going to wind up being a little bit on the compact side, but we're going to get into that now, and we'll start off. We're going to start with the satellite loop tonight. This system is better organized, but it is still not organized enough where we have a closed circulation yet. By the way, let me right off the bat, some of these satellite loops, like this one, and also the weather maps that you see, are courtesy of tropicaltidbits.com. And check out his YouTube channel as well, because he has a video out, and Levi Cowan does an absolutely spectacular job in explaining all the nuances when it comes to these tropical systems. Now, you'll notice that we do have convection that is southeast of the Florida coast. There really is not that much going on in South Florida at the moment, but we do have what appears to be a concentration of convection in the western Bahamas. And there's probably at least an open surface low, not completely closed off, but perhaps the beginnings of a low that's going to try and close off as it moves northwestward, probably moving across the Keys and then into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The convection that you see in the Gulf of Mexico, there's an upper air disturbance in the western Gulf, and you'll notice that the enhanced cloud tops that you see off the Florida west coast are actually moving almost north-south. So there's what we would call anticyclonic or an upper high. This is part of the ridge. This is the southern extent of the ridge that is building in the southeast part of the United States and in the Tennessee Valley. Whenever you have an upper high that's centered that far to the north, it creates a condition of lower than normal pressures across the Gulf of Mexico. And the fact that we have this anticyclone, this upper high, creates a rather a condition that would be conducive for tropical storm development, because the winds in the upper atmosphere aren't going to be all that strong. In other words, there won't be any wind. There won't be zero wind shear, but the wind shear will, I think, may be minimal enough to allow any surface low, once it gets in there, to start developing. And actually, if you look at the structure of the wave right now, the curvature, you see how those clouds are starting kind of arcing, taking the look like it wants to start turning cyclonically. If you're seeing that now, is indicative of the fact that the upper air conditions, which have been hostile up until this point, are now beginning to become more conducive. The upper air winds are diminishing, the wind shear diminishing, and this is going to allow for some development. It also will probably be a fairly substantial rain producer for South Florida when that wave goes by. There'll probably be on average several inches of rain, and maybe some spots will get 4 or 5 inches out of this before it starts its march on to the northwest. Now let's go and take a look at what the Hurricane Center is doing with all this. And you can see the track here. I have put the times on it. This is on their website, nhc.noaa.gov, which, if you are watching any, and I've said this many times, with respect to tropical systems, when it comes to any kind of decision making that you have to, that you might be faced with, you need to go to the National Hurricane Center's website, nhc.noaa.gov, and also consult your local officials, because they know your area best. They know your area best. I don't know, although I am familiar with Southeast Louisiana because I did work in New Orleans back in the mid-1980s for 3 years at WVUE TV. Now, you can see the track here. This shows, by the way, the reasonable time where tropical storm force winds would arrive. I'm not so sure how windy it's going to get across South Florida, mainly because of the low being in the development stage. So it's a kind of iffy proposition in terms of what kind of wind you're going to wind up out of this. I think it would be manageable if we were getting a situation where we were dealing with explosive deepening. Then we'd be talking a whole different story here. But I don't think you're going to see this thing explosively deepen. And there is going to be some interaction here with the Florida landmass, with the tropical wave. So that's going to kind of distort things a bit. So I think the opportunity for strengthening is going to come as it moves away from the Florida Keys and then heads toward the southeast Louisiana coast. And where you see the yellow, that is where the Hurricane Center has put tropical storm watches up. So just about from the central coast of Louisiana eastward to Boothville, back up to New Orleans, including Lake Pontchartrain, and then east across the Mississippi and Alabama Gulf Coast to the Florida border. We don't have any tropical storm watches up for any spot on the Florida shoreline. And unless this thing were to really start to wrap up in a hurry, it's probable that we will not need any kind of watches or warnings. I might be, those might be famous last words if this thing starts to gel up overnight and during the day tomorrow. But I think it really needs to sort of wait till it clears the Keys before it gets going. Now, the Hurricane Center is also keeping this as a tropical storm all the way through. Again, the issue is how much time. The fact that this is going to be moving along at a fairly decent clip is going to limit the amount of time over the Gulf. The Gulf of Mexico water temperatures are very warm. They're at 30 degrees Celsius or higher, which is certainly could be supportive of a system becoming a hurricane. But if this were moving further west and say heading for the Texas coast, where it would have more time over the open waters of the Gulf, then I would be a little bit more concerned about this attaining hurricane strength. But one of the things that the Hurricane Center forecasters have said many times, when it comes to track, they have they've done, and I believe they've done a very good job, and models have been getting better and better and better. The errors, the mile errors over time continue to shrink, but when it comes to intensity, it is a bit of a different ball game with all of this. Here's the wide view, by the way, so you can take a look at the whole Atlantic tropics from the African coast all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. So you get a good picture here of what's going on out there. So you have your system that's just east of Florida. You have Tropical Storm Florence, which is still not even to 40 degrees west, so it's way, way out there. It's east now of the Cabo Verde Islands. And then you have another tropical wave, by the way, that is moving off the African coast. And I think conditions here are also going to be conducive for development. This wave looks like it's moving out a little bit further south than where Florence did. So it might pass further south of the Cabo Verde Islands. Uh, the um, the ridge, the upper high that likely build behind it is behind Florence. Is probably going to keep this thing moving a bit more to that wave moving more to the west. But I'm not even going to pay any attention to that until something begins to gel up from that respect. So let's jump to the GFS model. And before we even look at the surface, I think it's probably good that we look at what's going on in the upper air first. And if you take a look at the upper air, you've got this big upper high. This is for tomorrow morning. Big upper high sitting right along the mid-Atlantic coast. You've got southeast winds at 18,000 feet blowing across the Bahamas and Florida to the Louisiana coast. So this system really has the alleyway opened up to head toward southeast Louisiana. So it really is going to be a matter of strengthening here, and and how much strengthening we're going to see. And the upper high just basically sits there. It hardly changes position going into Wednesday. So the natural path of least resistance is to the northwest, and the GFS and the European also very close, taking it right almost to the mouth of the Mississippi River here before moving it inland. And then that upper high, by the way, is going to sit in the east pretty much all week long. It only starts to weaken toward the end of the week, which might allow for a cold front to drop southward out of Canada. But the high is really steering all this. And when we go to the surface map on the GFS and the European as well, you're going to notice that this system is very tight. First off, on the map for, let me bring it up here. I'm going to bring up the new GFS. This is for this evening, and we'll jump up to 2 a.m. You still don't have a closed low, but you see the isobar that's down near Cuba there and comes northward, starts to turn. You don't have a closed circulation, but you have almost, let's say, a 3/4 closed circulation. You still actually, at least from the standpoint of the GFS, you don't really see the model showing a closed low here, even into tomorrow evening. It's not until we get to Tuesday morning that you finally have one little closed isobar there, and then that moves up toward the Louisiana coast. I'm going to back one run up so we can at least match up run to run. And here's where the GFS, there it is right there, that little closed isobar. I think it's because of the fact that it's the time issue here. Perhaps the model is underdoing things because of the fact that we're looking at the satellite right now, which seems to look more impressive than what the model was indicating. So it might be having to play catch up here over time. Here's the Europeans' view, and we'll bring up a surface map. Obviously, we don't have preset maps that we can show you. These are the maps that are only available publicly. But with respect to what the European does, same idea here on the surface from this morning. That high just kind of sits there along the East Coast, the upper high and the surface high. There's your relatively weak closed low southeast of the Louisiana coast, and then it moves it inland. It never really wraps it up into a deep low. So this is why we have to be a little careful here, because we could error this on both sides. You could wind up with this tropical wave staying strong and trying to close off a surface low, but never quite getting there. And yet, on the other hand, you could also have a situation where the models are just not seeing the fact that this thing could develop perhaps faster than indicated. So we're just going to watch. The best thing we can do now at this point is we know what the issues are. We're just going to have to watch this hour by hour, and take it from there. Here's, by the way, this is WPC, the Weather Prediction Center, and this is their 7-day rainfall forecast. I like to use this because the guys at WPC and the ladies as well, they do a very good job here, I think, in terms of laying out an overall profile when it comes to rainfall. I've used this map quite a bit over the last couple of months and have paid close attention to it. And they've done a good job at picking out some of these big rain events. And you'll notice that there's a max area of rain in southern Florida. So this will be from the wave going by tomorrow, later tonight and tomorrow. And then you have another max area of rain, the scale on the side there. So you get into those oranges and yellows, and you're talking about 4 or 5 inches of rain or more. So again, this is over the 7-day period. And by the way, that heavy rain also extends into southeast Texas and elsewhere along the boundary where the upper high is centered. You'll notice that the rainfall amounts are rather minimal, under 3/4 of an inch, and in many cases under a half an inch in the east. You see that there. Near the boundary zone between where the edge of the upper high is and the southern extent of the westerlies in Canada, you have a second max area of rain, and that runs from the southern plains all the way up through the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes. So it looks like that area as well is going to wind up seeing some hefty rains from being near the boundary zone of the upper high and the westerlies in Canada. So that's where the frontal boundary is going to be setting up. I do have a couple of the radar. I just want to show you, and this is as of 10 o'clock right now, 10 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're watching this on a replay, please always remember that the radars are dated, and you're going to want to check your local National Weather Service office if you're watching from Florida in particular, and you can do that by going to weather.gov and then clicking on the map, click on your area in Florida, and you'll bring up the local office. Right now, we're just seeing a couple of bands of showers. The main action is still from the Bahamas on eastward, so we're going to have to just wait for the axis of that wave to move westward overnight, and then I think you're going to start to see the rains increase over Florida, southern Florida later tonight and during the day tomorrow. Back also along the Louisiana coast, what's going on now is that we do have, this is the upper air disturbance I told you about earlier that is producing some rains in southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas. And we also have some areas of convection moving into southeast Louisiana. And there's also some convection that's there along the Florida Panhandle. This is not related to none of this is related to the tropical system per se. So again, we're going to revisit this obviously tomorrow, and we'll see what happens overnight in terms of the development and where we're going to be going with all of this. Here's another satellite view, and you can see how it looks like. This is how it looks like when you take a look at it from the vantage point of Florida eastward. And where you see the blossoming bright white clouds, that is the cloud tops. That's where the heaviest convection is, and it all seems to be on the eastern side of the axis of this wave. That tells you that you don't really have a close circulation yet. But you also can see that kind of cyclonic look that it's beginning to take. So it's getting its act together as the conditions aloft begin to improve. Now here's the wide satellite view. So now you've got the whole picture here. You have the wave. You've got this disturbance that's in the western Gulf that is not going to become any kind of tropical storm. You've got the wave that's approaching Florida. You've got Florence, that ball that's sitting out in the Atlantic, and then you've got the next wave that's coming off the African coast that has quite a bit of convection with it. By the way, if you look at Florence, the circulation of Florence is actually quite large. When you look at the extent of the cloud cover on the east and on the west side, and how those clouds are rotating. And there's a band that extends out from the intertropical convergence zone and goes up into Tropical Storm Florence. And this is it's trying to establish some kind of tropical feed to it. The problem is, at least for now, and there are a couple of issues with Florence. You do have some action in between the wave that is in the Bahamas and Florence itself. There's a trough that extends down into the central Atlantic, and there's some wind shear going on. And this is, I think, going to prevent Florence from becoming too strong, or it may just hold its own going forward as far as strength is concerned. And that's very important because the if the system does not strengthen, and this could be one of the problems that the GFS has been having with Florence, in that it has been strengthening it too much. And as a result, we have been seeing the GFS turning this thing to the north. When you have a strong system, you oftentimes have to look higher up in the atmosphere in order to find some sense of where it's going to be going. But if it stays weak, relatively speaking, if it stays a tropical storm like this with top winds of 50, 55, or 60 miles an hour, might even be able to get a little stronger than that. But if it doesn't become a hurricane, and particularly if it doesn't become a major hurricane while it's out there, it's going to probably want to get steered by the lower level winds. And those lower level winds are predominantly from east to west. I think what's going to happen with this is that it's going to remain relatively let's call it underdeveloped, and it's going to probably have to wait until it gets west of 60 degrees west, because I think at that point is where you're going to get into some very warm ocean water. You're also, which by the way, while the ocean water temperatures are supportive for tropical storm development and for tropical storm strength, we're still talking about below average temperature ocean water temperatures in the eastern Atlantic and in the tropical Atlantic. Not by a lot, but it's enough that it's having some impact. But you start to see a more of a normalization of those ocean water temperatures once you get west of 55 and 60 west. So unlike what we were seeing earlier this week with the models trying to show the system reacting to a trough in the central Atlantic, and if you look straight north from where it is here, this is Wednesday morning, you do have a strong storm between Labrador and Greenland, and a trailing cold front that runs offshore east of Newfoundland. So there's an upper trough that's extending southward here, but there's a narrow ridge in between. And as long as it stays weak, you're going to see Florence react to the low-level steering, which is going to want to take it more to the west. The GFS on today's runs has finally woken up to this idea, which is something that the European has been showing all along. And you'll notice, by the way, I'll back it up again. You know, you've got these pressures that are about 990 or 990-ish. Once it starts to get west of 60, you suddenly start to see these pressures drop down to 972, 965, 954. The specific numbers, I can't really tell you that that's going to be correct or not, but I think the trend is probably correct, in that we'll be at this point a week from today where we're going to be seeing this sitting right along 60 degrees west, assuming it doesn't recurve. This would be a point where you would probably begin to see it strengthen. And by the way, the European, and I'll show you the European on Florence, has an even weaker look to it. Now, here's where we don't know. I mean, the GFS really kind of wraps it up, and from here, assuming it gets to this point, which is about 65 and getting ready to get close to 70 west, the question is what's going to be going on in the United States with regards to the jet stream in the upper air. We do have some kind of trough that the GFS seems to be wanting to drop into the east, or at least into the Great Lakes. Is it real? Is it not real? Is that ridge in the east going to be strong? That is another big question here. Also, I would really emphasize, try not to get too wrapped up. I know these models are all available. Anybody can see them. You can go to tropicaltidbits.com and you can look at them for yourself. Please understand that these things change. The further out you go in time, you're going to see these things, these models change, and they can change radically, as we've already seen in the last several days with regards to that. The weaker system idea seems to be verifying. Now, here's the upper air, and there's an upper high there in the central Atlantic, but you also see at the end of the week you've got the jet stream kind of lowering into the eastern part of the United States because you've got this rather deep upper air system that's between Labrador and Greenland. And that trough, you notice how it's kind of trying to drop southward, but it misses Florence because Florence stays relatively underdeveloped, and now suddenly it is reacting to the upper high that is rebuilding off the Atlantic coast. And here is the GFS's question, talking 9 days from now. A lot of variability here. This could be total. This could wind up not looking like this at all. But you watch what's going on in the United States east of the Mississippi. You do have a very broad trough that's dropping down. Does Florence react to that by opening up, going into the opening that occurs as the ridge in the Atlantic moves out? I always use the analogy of the gearbox, the old toddler's toy with the gears. You put the gears in the puzzle and the gears together. When all the gears are in there, one of the gears has a handle. You turn the handle, and all the other gears turn, and the kid's happy. Well, the atmosphere. If you look at how the upper air atmosphere with these gears, all right, this same principle. The only difference is that the gears are constantly moving. They're changing in strength. They're changing in size and coverage. New ones form, new gears form, old gears disappear, and this is the battle, trying to figure out how the timing of all of this, because if the timing of one thing changes, it changes the timing of everything. Now, the European, which as I said, at least from the beginning, seems to be showing has a better grasp in terms of the steering and the strength of this, at least so far. And that's also important to remember. But just past performance is not always an indicator of future results. But the European, if you watch Florence there, which is that lead low east of the Leeward Islands, actually weakens considerably as it approaches as it goes well north and east of the Leewards. But that pressure would be indicative of a tropical depression. So it argues that perhaps that there's enough shearing going on that Florence may wind up weakening, and if it does, it's going to want to go further to the west. But what the European also does is once it goes west of 60, conditions become rather favorable for development, and suddenly it blows it up when it's northeast of the Bahamas. But the other factor here to consider as we look at the upper air, this is the Europeans' view for next Tuesday. Okay, upper high off from the New Jersey coast, east of Bermuda. You've got Florence kind of tucked in underneath it. The flow across the Great Lakes and Northeast is basically west to east, but there's no trough that's dropping into the Great Lakes. If we switch to the GFS by comparison, and we'll bring that up, look at the difference. Look at the difference that's going on across Hudson's Bay down through the Great Lakes on the GFS, where it has this broad trough that drops in. The European is nothing like this. So the European is basically saying that this ridge that is building in the east and how that ridge changes as we go forward is going to probably have the biggest impact on this, on Florence and where it winds up. The GFS at day 10, okay, has a ridge along the east coast. And as a result, it wants to bring in Florence around the base of that upper high. That's the European. The GFS, on the other hand, has this next trough dropping in. Huge, huge difference in the upper air. One of these models is going to cave to the other. Maybe it'll be a compromise. Maybe The GFS is way overdone, and I will tell you that the GFS has been overdone on these troughs lately in the last couple of weeks in the long range. Seems to be overdoing these troughs that have been coming in, and they wind up being much weaker. And that's why, we've been seeing sometimes model runs showing these big pushes of dry air coming in to the eastern part of the United States. Uh, just the other day, the GFS showed dew points in the 30s dropping in through upstate New York and New England, and a really solid push of dry air with a big high coming across the into New England, and a northeast gradient. But at the same time, the GFS was also developing Florence into a major hurricane and recurving it at 50 degrees west. So if it stays weak, I think it misses this trough, and then we're going to have to really start looking very, very closely. We'll be getting it by at this point. We're going to be a week from today, so we'll be looking to see what's going on in the east. Obviously, there's nothing here that says that even remotely says we need to be concerned. Okay, how you handle this at this point is that it's out there, and that there's a whole lot of variables to play with when it comes to these things, and we're going to have so many model runs to look at this week, and we'll look at them together. Now, let me come back to the U.S. Let's just talk about the weather in the short range, because in the east, with the ridge building in the east, it's back to disgusting heat and humidity for the next 4 days. We'll rev it up somewhat tomorrow, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday with nothing but high pressure along the mid-Atlantic coast. That other high that you see there in southeastern Canada, there is a bit of a backdoor front that makes it to about Boston to Albany to central Michigan. Okay, it doesn't push much further south than that. It tries, but that front is going to weaken considerably. So I think that Tuesday may wind up being the hottest day for areas from southern New England down into the northern mid-Atlantic states, when we should make it up. I think the basic temperature range will be about 90 to 95. And then going on into Thursday, this is when you'll have a more important front approaching later Thursday afternoon and Thursday evening, with some thunderstorms possibly. And then it stalls, much like what we've seen now with what happened this weekend. It stalls, and this time around, the model, the GFS at least, to a lesser extent, I think the European, but the GFS kind of wants to hold that high up west of Maine, and as it gradually gets into the Canadian Maritimes, it's much slower. So you wind up with that front trying to come back as a warm front, producing some downpours and thunderstorms next weekend. And in fact, they look fairly significant with respect to the low the surface low that moves up through northern Michigan. Not too much happening out in the west. Because of the fact of that all the action seems to be in the east, other than the usual monsoon stuff, and even that seems to be diminishing as we go through through this week and into next week. So the west, at least, looks fairly quiet. It's going to be hard to resolve all of this. You're certainly not going to wake up tomorrow morning and know. You see how all these puzzle pieces that are running around on the models, and how different the upper air is with respect for the European versus the GFS. I saw one of you guys mentioned on the board on the Canadian. I didn't even look at the Canadian, but since we can, why don't we give that a look and see what's happening and what it does? Up until last night, I didn't look at it today, so this is new even for me. Does seem to keep the system, keeps Florence weaker now. It was trying to recurve it starting tomorrow, taking it straight north. So obviously, I'm looking now, it didn't do that this time around, and it actually carries it along fairly far to the west, very similar to the Europeans' idea here. So they're on the same page. The GFS, again, with that trough that's dropping in. Just a quick look at the upper air. Yeah, the Canadian's almost a compromise between the European and the GFS, because the Canadian does have some troughing into the Great Lakes, but it's not as deep and not as broad as the GFS is. a trough in that position is going to be important if anything does wind up getting to off the southeast coast of the United States, because ultimately that will determine where this all winds up. So I'm going to now come over to the chat board and talk to you guys, which is a good thing for me to do. So hang on one second. We've got plenty of time here tonight. And if you got some questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them, or comments. You guys, by the way, those of you who are here all the time, you know that how fairly even keeled I tend to be with all this stuff. I don't jump off the deep end. When the day comes that I jump off the deep end, you'll know that it's a problem. But now be patient with me, because I'm rolling back to the beginning, and just want to mention that Winx Club tonight came in first. Wayne S. Came in second. We had Fox Legends 1 coming in third for show. And then next on the board was Johnny Quest, who rounds out the Superfecta, and Michael M. 1996 rounds out the Super High Five. So me and horse racing, always a good thing. Evan Deese, thank you for being on board. I'm glad you jumped on the chat like you said, like you did, and we appreciate it. Wayne S., thank you for hitting super chat tonight. Also, appreciate that very, very much. Roy Babin, hi, good evening to you. Being from Louisiana and suffering from recent flooding, I'm deeply concerned with storms now, and I'm glad to see people live streaming current storms. Great. Join us. I live stream here usually. Well, when there's nothing going on, I usually live stream once a day around 6 o'clock Eastern, either 6 o'clock Eastern or 8 o'clock Eastern time. But I'm thinking over the next couple of days, you'll be seeing me in the morning and in the evening. Shelly Man Studios, haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you here. Just moving on. Okay, Weather Hub TV, welcome aboard. Isaiah Jacob, Charleston, South Carolina, National Weather Service, Charleston, South Carolina. That is your go-to place for the latest weather information. Dio Nan Kumar, good to see you on board as always. And Anthony Orr, our resident statistician here, is always coming up with some great hurricane facts. By the way, it's amazing how everything, the switch just basically flipped, was flipped in the on position as soon as we got to the very end of August. And it does really look like we're going to continue in a rather active period going forward as far as tropical storms and hurricanes are concerned on the Atlantic side. Johnny Quest, you're referring to Hurricane Norman, which is a Category 4 hurricane moving westward. It is going to turn northwest and north and pass well to the northeast, I believe, of the Hawaiian Islands. I really didn't give it too close a look, so I won't bring up the maps about it. But from what I did see, it doesn't appear to be a threat to the Hawaiian Islands, at least from the standpoint of what we're seeing right now. Tanker 216, welcome. I know it's a bit out of the way, but what are the chances that Florence would make landfall in New Jersey? I don't think that that's a question that I could really address right now based on what we're looking at. Everything at this point is purely in a speculative mode. And for me to come out and give you a number, I really can't do that. It doesn't, there's no value to it. I think where the value is the fact that, something is out there, and you also know that there's a lot of, from what I just showed you, that there are a whole lot of variables in play here. And usually the odds of all those variables come together to produce a landfalling hurricane is rare. We don't get hurricane strikes here in the Northeast and even into the Mid-Atlantic states every year, every other year, or every other year. You do, if you look at the stats, maybe every 7 years, every 8 years, you get a landfalling hurricane when you go north of 35 degrees north. Some places the number might be a little bit lower. Some places it might be a little bit higher. Of course, those numbers go up as you go south of down into the Carolinas, and especially as you get down toward the Florida coast and on both the east and on the east coast, the Florida east coast, and obviously the Gulf Coast. But there's no way to give you a a, 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 um, a good answer to the question of what the chance is. Everything is out there. We'll keep watching it, and every day that goes by, we'll be able to quantify it a bit better. I did see a question that was on here just a second ago. Jake, do we watch storms in the Western Pacific also? Well, when they do storms in the Western Pacific, if they're going to have some impact, we do pay attention to them. When we had the hurricane last week, Hurricane Lane, that went to Hawaii, we spent a lot of time live streaming, and we did have folks from Hawaii watching, which is great. So yes, we do on occasion do look at the storms in the West. Kevin McKenzie, is the GFS or Euromo accurate in predicting how quickly pressure moves off North America? Kevin, the two models, they have their moments. Each one has its moment where it dominates um, uh, the uh, the forecast, where one does better than the other. But the problem is sometimes is that there are points where that stops happening, and you could, if you're not watching it carefully, if you're solely relying on one model simply because that's the one that's always working, you could get caught flat-footed. In general, the European does tend to do better with these tropical systems than the GFS has in the past. The GFS does tend to have a bit of an eastward bias with them. Sometimes the GFS is right with regards to the eastward bias, but the European seems to handle them much better. So we also bear that in mind when we're looking at all this stuff and trying to figure out where this is going to go as we move forward. William F., I wonder if the Gulf storm will strengthen more than predicted. It seems like they're due for a strong storm. The pieces for this to strengthen is certainly there, uh, are certainly there, especially with the fact that you've got the water in the Gulf of Mexico right now is at its warmest of the season, and its water temperatures above 30 are certainly easily can support a major hurricane. I think the problem is that you've got the upper air is going to improve, but it's not going to become super conducive. It'll become somewhat conducive for development, but it's not going to become super conducive. You're not going to suddenly go to ideal conditions for strengthening where the thing just explodes rapidly. At least it doesn't seem to that doesn't seem to be the case. I would be more concerned right now if at least one of the weather models had taken this surface low up until today anyway, and really just kind of wrapped it up like crazy. In other words, intensified it like crazy between Monday and Wednesday, I would probably be a bit more concerned. But right now, I would shy away from that. But that's not to say that it can't strengthen into a rather strong tropical storm and become a big rain problem for somebody. Maybe wind won't be the big issue, and maybe tides won't be the big issue. But the bigger issue in all of this could wind up being rain. I don't think Fox Legends. I think it rides the edge of that upper high. So I'm thinking that it probably will tend to move toward the area that the Hurricane Center is indicating. All the models seem to be in very close agreement on that, including most of the hurricane tracking models. They're kind of tightly clustered. So when they're tightly clustered, we tend to have a high degree of confidence with regards to where the system is going to wind up, particularly because we're not talking about 5 or 6 days from now. We're talking, basically inside 72 hours. So I don't think the error is going to be that large enough where it winds up moving further west, at least from what I'm seeing right now. The tropical systems, as we know, can be extremely volatile. Subtle changes in the upper atmosphere can change the whole dynamic. But the Hurricane Center's track forecasts have gotten very good over the last couple of years. The margin of error in terms of miles continues to shrink. So I take that with a very strong degree of confidence going forward. So I'm going to lean against it where something of it going further to the west. Let me just say real quick here, we're going to wrap it up at this point. Thanks very much for being here. I just want to let you know, I'm going to put the link up here. A number of you have asked me, and many of you have been very supportive of my work. And I really appreciate it. You hit super chat, which is great. I did set up a page on Patreon, and what I'm doing is I'm putting up website posts, my website posts, which is meteorologistjoecioffi.com, and you can always go there. But I've also been putting those posts up on Patreon. The posts come up clean. There are no ads. They load fast. If you join Patreon for a minimal amount, you'll get notifications with new website posts, and you will have a pretty good experience, because I'm going to be putting, once everything gets settled, I will be putting on things on Patreon that I will not be putting on websites, and I will probably also be doing videos directly solely to Patreon members, although I will always continue to do what I'm doing here on YouTube, but I may do some specific videos just for those of you who would be join up on Patreon. So I put the link up there, and thank you very much for your consideration. Once again, let me just remind everybody, maps are courtesy of tropicaltidbits.com, so we thank Levi Cowan for that. Consult your local National Weather Service office or the National Hurricane Center regarding decisions that you may have to make in regards to any threats from tropical storms or hurricanes. And weather model maps, or any maps that we show you, should not be used for decision making. And I think that's very, very important. I want to emphasize that. Okay, the maps that you see are models, and they're guidance. They are not forecasts, and you don't want to use those as far as making decisions are concerned. Just go to the Hurricane Center, go to your local National Weather Service office, or consult your local officials. And I'm a participant in the Amazon and the eBay Services Associates program. They're affiliate advertising programs designed to provide a means for this channel to earn fees by linking to Amazon and affiliated sites. The links are up there on the description of this video. If you link to Amazon and you use the search box and you buy something, you get your stuff at great Amazon prices, and Amazon throws me back some coin. If you use Ebates, you get cash back on your purchase, and Ebates will throw me back a little bit of coin. I get to get myself a couple of cigars and a cup of coffee, and that makes my day. Okay, so we will see you tomorrow. Things are changing. If things look like they're changing rapidly tomorrow morning, I'll do a live stream in the morning, and then again tomorrow evening sometime. Check my YouTube channel for a time. I will schedule it there, so this way you'll know, and you won't miss it. Plus, you should be getting notifications if you subscribe. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, it costs absolutely, that doesn't cost you a thing, and you'll get notifications when new videos arrive. And by the way, on Patreon, the same thing. You will get notifications when new posts are up, videos are up, and all the rest of it. Chantel M., thanks for being here. You're new to the board, and I really appreciate it. We have already saturated ground here in Tampa, and if you get a tropical storm, it will cause flooding issues. If that wave develops, in what time frame would it happen? It'll be developing, tomorrow night, and Tuesday. I think the rain is going to be more south of you, but you're going to be under the influence of that wave, so I can't rule out the possibility that there won't be additional downpours in West Florida from Tampa south, but I think it's probably going to be more from, say, Port Charlotte southward to the Keys, and particularly Naples down to the Keys, where you could wind up with some hefty rains. But I'm gonna go with the notion that at least the further north you go up in Florida, the less in terms of rain you're going to get. But Florida sits there in the tropics and subtropics, and you get one good burst, and suddenly you've got flooding issues. And I have been noticing that there's been quite a bit of rain along the west coast of Florida for much of this week, and that's indicative of what's been happening across the Atlantic with respect to the tropics and the subtropics saturating in order for these systems to start developing. That's one of the many things that was absent during July and August. Suddenly now we've got kind of a tropical bonanza there going on with all the moisture. Weatherman 7.4. You can't really say anything with regards to specifics. You know, when you're saying if it hits New Jersey, it'll be a 4 times stronger than Hurricane Sandy. We don't know that any of that's going to happen, if it happens at all. This could still wind up being, you know, for the East Coast, it could still wind up being something that goes out and is no factor other than kicking up the surf. So I really wouldn't, I would not agree with what your statement is based on what we're seeing at the moment. Okay, just so we're clear. Okay, so leaving it at that. And Johnny Quest, I want to acknowledge the fact that yes, you've already gotten your normal rainfall for the month of September on the first couple of days. I'm not surprised. For those of you who don't know, Johnny lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they have been the rain has been in several feet or more since I think probably the beginning of June. It's been unbelievable how much rain has fallen in that part of the Mid-Atlantic. And the month of August, they beat out their August rainfall on the first day, the August normal rainfall on the first day, and they've beaten out the September. I have some pictures that I put up from him on Facebook, and it's just astounding. The swamp that it's become with respect to the rainfall, unbelievable. So anyway, we'll leave it at that, folks. Thanks very much for being here. 51-minute live stream. That's pretty good for me. Anyway, my record I think is 88 minutes according to Delvin from Boston, who monitors the times of my videos, and he lets me know when I'm approaching a record or not. So it's not even close. Have a great night, folks. Enjoy the rest of your Labor Day holiday weekend, and we will see you tomorrow with the latest on the potential tropical cyclone moving into the Gulf and Tropical Storm Florence.